Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is the 19th of December. It's Friday evening by the time you're watching this. And by the end of this weekend, Indiana will know who they're playing in the Rose Bowl as Alabama and Oklahoma play tonight. The rest of the first-round games for the college football playoff happening on Saturday. It's an exciting time for Indiana, not the least of which is that they're not playing this weekend like they did last year. Instead, they earned the bye, they earned the number one seed, and they'll be playing on New Year's Day. But we're very excited to keep an eye on what's going on across college football. Very important viewing for Indiana fans as we try to get a sense of who Indiana's opponents might be moving forward in this college football playoff. Hello, I'm Galen Clavio, and I might have said that already. I apologize. You don't normally get to see me in a jacket and tie. Just came from commencement ceremonies here at IU. I'm looking forward to a fun weekend of football. I had a few things I wanted to talk about, and then we've got a interview coming up later on in this podcast. We bring Andy Wittry back on the show. Andy was a journalist within the college sports and especially college football landscape for quite a while, worked for On3, worked for a couple of other sites, getting his master's degree now, but still retains a tremendous amount of knowledge and insight about the world of college sports, especially on the business front. So we had a wide-ranging conversation with him that I taped earlier this week, talking about all of the things going on, private equity coming into college sports, the financial realities of things, Indiana football in this landscape, just so many different items that we were able to cover with Andy. Really good conversation. Hopefully you will enjoy that. We'll have more content coming up throughout the course of this upcoming next week or so, as I know many of you have been starved for IU football content. You've watched all of the videos that have been put out by all of the different outlets, or you've listened to the podcasts, and we want to make sure that as you and your family are hanging out this holiday season, that you've got as much content as you want to get you ready for what will be, up to this point, the biggest game in IU football history as they head to that quarterfinal in the Rose Bowl on the 1st of January. Before we launch into the main show, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Homefield just continues to roll out amazing stuff. I'm assuming that by this point, everybody got a chance to shop or at least view the Rose Bowl special that they put together for IU. Just an amazing selection of apparel, some of the best I've seen out of Homefield over the course of the many years that they've been affiliated with us. And you can see, of course, that bomber jacket, that might be the cleanest single piece of apparel I've ever seen them produce. You've got great items, the Rose Bowl hat in corduroy, the Meet Me in Pasadena bison tee. You've got a great quarter zip. You've got some wonderful, very classic designs commemorating Indiana's return to the Rose Bowl, their first time in the Rose Bowl since 1968. We just look at some of this stuff. Absolutely awesome. And it's some great hats, too, incorporating some iconic Rose logos. So get over to Homefield Apparel if you've not yet shopped there. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. Sign up for their newsletter. You can do that automatically when you go to purchase. They'll log your email. They'll send you things. Find out about stuff early. Also follow them on social media. Homefield Apparel on X, Homefield Apparel on Instagram, Homefield Apparel on Facebook. I mean, they've got all the socials covered, and they do a great job with the content, helping to tell the stories behind the designs that connect to the various brands. And there's so many brands, like 300 plus brands that they have in the store. So go check out homefieldapparel.com, presenting sponsor of the Back Home Network. Happy to have them along for this entire magical journey that started with a shirt that simply said the kick was good in early 2016. So thank you again to Homefield Apparel, and we look forward to seeing them out in Pasadena. Before we get to our interview and discussion with Andy Wittry, a couple of items on the table to discuss. First of all, a great scene out at Memorial Stadium earlier today, IU Athletics announced that they were going to be doing a rally towel distribution at Memorial Stadium at 2:30 on Friday. And folks, I went out there to check it out, and it was amazing, the line that was there for IU football. It stretched all the way out the entrance to the East Concourse, all the way out in the parking lot, all the way around the parking lot, back towards the stadium. And when I was there was still a line of cars trying to get in and get rally towels. A ton of people went out there to pick up towels, and the line went very smoothly from all accounts. People are fired up about this IU football team, as they should be, as the Hoosiers making history. And of course, obviously, Fernando Mendoza, as we talked about earlier in the week, winning the Heisman Trophy, another historic first, and something I think, like a lot of IU fans, I keep talking about this with people. IU fans are just not used to being at the epicenter of college football. And you don't realize how rare it is to win a Heisman Trophy. You've got brands and schools in the Big Ten that have never won a Heisman Trophy. And it's fascinating because, you always think about the big brands, the Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Ohio State, they all have 7 Heisman trophies. Alabama has 4, Michigan, LSU, Auburn have 3. But what's fascinating is the number of schools that are relatively big football brands that don't have a Heisman Trophy in their cabinet at all. And, it's like a name that many people find synonymous with, at least competitive football. Tennessee, no Heisman trophies in their history. Purdue, no Heisman trophies in their history. You've got other schools in the mix that have been either national champions or have been in the mix for playoffs and things like that. Michigan State, no Heisman trophy. So for Indiana to have added themselves to what is a very elite and exclusive club from a school perspective of having a Heisman Trophy winner it's just one of those things. I think Zach Osterman in the Indy Star described as one of the types of things that helps you maintain as a college football power. The entry to that club is very exclusive. Everything has to come together, and it's fascinating and awesome to watch it all come together for Indiana in this magical 2-season run that Curt Cignetti and his staff have managed to put together, that the players have gone out and have managed to piece together on the field. And watching this whole thing get built brick by brick, and watching Indiana not just win games, not just win championships, not just be on the national stage, but this kind of thing. This is something that, when they put the Heisman Trophy winners back up on stage like they did for the ceremony that Fernando Mendoza won his in, Fernando Mendoza is going to get invited for the rest of his life. It is one of the most exclusive athletic clubs that you can be a part of. And it's a really unique one because it's clearly a brotherhood of among the most successful and most lionized college football players that you've ever had. And it's much like the Baseball Hall of Fame, which is the one Hall of Fame that I think still carries the most weight and the most juice, for lack of a better term, in terms of how hard it is to get in. And the Heisman Trophy is voted on just like that. And it's not that the voters get it all right all the time, but very few people will look at a Heisman Trophy winner and say that guy didn't deserve to be in there. That guy didn't do what he needed to do. And it just adds to the mystique of Indiana football. And Fernando Mendoza, such a wonderful representative of the university, such a wonderful representative of what IU athletics wants to stand for, what this football program wants to stand for. I've just been reflecting on that all week. And it's just so awesome that Indiana and Fernando Mendoza found each other, and that the environment that has been created with IU football didn't just produce a Heisman Trophy winner, but gets recognized on a national stage in front of the entire nation. And that will be as much of a testament as anything to what Curt Cignetti has already built here, and what I know that Cignetti and his staff and Scott Dolson and the entire Indiana University establishment are hoping to continue to move forward with over the course of not just the next year or 2 years, but for a long time in the future. Speaking of that, the big news that I think everybody saw, but maybe you didn't. But huge news, Mike Shanahan, the offensive coordinator, signing a deal that extends him as the offensive coordinator. It's a 3-year deal. And so much like the deal that we saw, I think was it last week or early this week, when it was finally announced the final details with Bryant Haines, the defensive coordinator for Indiana, getting a deal that makes him among the highest paid coordinators in all of the game. Mike Shanahan gets the same thing, essentially. And it appears, based upon the reporting that we've seen, that a 3-year deal, which is supposed to pay him, I think, in a very similar range to what Bryant Haines is making. So somewhere in the $2.5 to $3 million a year range. This is so important for Indiana on so many different levels. And it, I think, first and foremost, what makes it so impressive and so fascinating to me, and one of the things that we talked about when we talked about the Bryant Haines extension, is Indiana University and Indiana athletics realizing that there is value in putting their money into staff, into stability, and ensuring that Shanahan and Haines, who are responsible for units that are not just nationally ranked, but ranked in the top 10 of offense and defense, respectively, are getting properly rewarded and paid commensurate with what the highest levels of this sport will pay for that. And for those who might look at it and say, well, that's a lot of money, it is a lot of money, but you have to understand the economies of scale that are at work within college athletics right now. Continuity, I talked about this on Twitter earlier today. Continuity in staff is so important. And to me, it's kind of been one of the underrated secret sauce elements of what's made Indiana so successful, is that Curt Cignetti's brought so much of his staff with him from James Madison. Bob Bostad was here already as the offensive line coach, and he was brought along. But all of this group of coaches that are here, with a couple of exceptions of the folks that were here before, this was a group that came with Curt Cignetti from James Madison. And in many cases, including Haines and Shanahan, this was a group of coaches that were with him before that. They were with him at Elon. They were with him at, in some cases, Indiana, Pennsylvania. So this is a group that he has learned to work with and has a comfort with. And there is clearly a real comfort in how they do their jobs. And, it's a little bit different with defense and offense. We've heard Curt Cignetti talk about how he just has essentially handed the defense over to Bryant Haines because of how well he understands it. And keep in mind, Bryant Haines had not been the defensive coordinator for that long at James Madison. To watch him emerge as such a unique strategic and tactical figure within the game and be so valuable that opposing coaches, as we've read about in several of the articles out there, are pointing out him specifically. I was reading this piece in The Athletic where they were talking through, how do you evaluate the various teams, who's got a legitimate shot at winning the national championship. When you saw the conversation about Indiana, one of the things that was pointed out specifically was Bryant Haines, how well he masks and changes his own tendencies, how well he uses a very flexible set of personnel to create misdirection, to create confusion. We talked about that a bunch in our last episode. It is so critical that you have coaches who understand how to do that in today's day and age, and it's a huge strategic and tactical advantage for Indiana football. Mike Shanahan's the same way. And as much as Curt Cignetti still has input into the offense and clearly knows what he wants to do, Shanahan has been able to assemble an offense that has been in the top 15 the last couple of years at Indiana. And that's not something that you should take for granted. This is something where Mike Shanahan last year had a different co-offensive coordinator in Tino Sunseri, who ended up going and becoming the offensive coordinator at UCLA for about half the season this year. Obviously, things went south very quickly under Deshaun Foster. Bring in Chandler Whitmer, who serves as co-OC and quarterbacks coach this year, and the offense actually took a bigger leap than it did last year in Shanahan's first year. Shanahan and what he does with that offense has been so impressive. And as good as the defense has been, Shanahan's offense, if you look at it from a numbers perspective and from a rankings perspective, has just been exemplary over the course of this 2 years. And so it is a real advantage for Indiana to be able to say, We've got both those guys coming back. A lot of people actually reacted with shock that Indiana not just ponied up for those coaches, but those coaches didn't take jobs elsewhere. And this is where the economies come into play, because if you think about it, right now, about $3 million a year for a top coordinator would place you about 60th in the country in FBS head coach salaries. And as I mentioned last time, it's fascinating in 10 years that Indiana goes from paying their head coach, Kevin Wilson, about $3 million a year to paying two assistants about that amount of money and paying their head coach the third highest salary, at least going into this offseason cycle, of any program in the country. That's a real financial investment, and that's what helps you sustain in this environment. So if you're Mike Shanahan, if you're Bryant Haines, you're both around 40. You could go take a head coaching job at a group of 5 school, as Brian Hartline did, leaving Ohio State and going down and coaching South Florida. But you could also look at it and say, well, if I don't have the financial investment from the school that wants to hire me, I'm better off staying here and continuing to enhance my reputation, starting to use recruits and transfers that are coming to Indiana specifically to seek my tutelage, because they're seeing all of these players on both sides of the ball for Indiana that are now draft prospects. The Elijah Surratts, the Omar Coopers, the Fernando Mendozas, the Carter Smiths, but and then on the defensive side of the ball, the array of players that got drafted last year. CJ West comes in for 1 year, gets drafted by the San Francisco 49ers. Tyreek Tucker is on the trajectory for that. Aiden Fisher, Mikhail Kamara, D'Angelo Pons, Isaiah Jones, and many others, Lewis Moore. This is starting to become a place where football players really want to come, because they see what IU's coaching staff can do for their prospects. And the fact that what works here in Bloomington for IU football translates very well in the eyes of NFL scouts to what will work at that level. That's a powerful message. And that's a message that I think a lot of coaches are envious of across the country. And for Mike Shanahan and Bryant Haines to be able to have the stability of making that amount of money, being a coordinator, being able to concentrate on your area, continuing to learn and soak up things from Curt Cignetti, and having the example of Cignetti, of a guy who waited until his late 40s to really start his head coaching trajectory, knowing that you're not wasting time, you're actually buying yourself some time, and you're putting yourself in a position to where bigger jobs, better supported jobs at the Power 4 level, when they come open, they're going to want to hire Indiana's defensive coordinator or Indiana's offensive coordinator. That's a much better position to be in. It's a win-win for everybody. And for Indiana to be able to say, we're going to have continuity, at least at our coordinator levels, between last year and this year, you'll have 3 straight years of Indiana rolling out the same strategies, the same tactics with tweaks, as we've seen, based upon personnel, but being able to attract even more impressive talent to go along with what's already transferred in and been developed here. It's a really exciting thing for the coaches, and it's a really exciting thing for the fans. I'm really juiced about it. Like you saw me, I was pumped when we got the Bryant Haines announcement. I was also pumped when we got the Mike Shanahan announcement yesterday. This is what big-time programs do. I'm still dizzy trying to get my head wrapped around Indiana doing all of this for their football program. But I think everybody's got the taste of winning in their mouth. And this is the time to strike. Indiana's on top of the football world right now. 13-0, Big Ten champs, undefeated regular season, Rose Bowl, #1 seed overall. Other than winning the national title, it doesn't get better than this. But it can stay as good as this. And this is how you help it stay as good. This is exciting times. I'm really pumped. I hope that you are as well. And whether or not you're trying to maintain some level of neutrality on this, if you're a journalist, it's a great story. And it's something that I see over and over again. Even fans of Ohio State on message boards, fans of of Nebraska, fans of Alabama. The amount of, wow, Indiana's really serious about football that I see out of those fans, and the amount of respect and the amount of envy, but it's like not envy in a negative way. It's like a awe, I think is the word I'm looking for, that Indiana's been able to do this, and that they're not just accepting like this was beamed down from above and it's like, oh, that was great, but we're not going to put the money behind it. The fact that Indiana is making moves that are to some degree dictating what's going on around college football is amazing to me. And I've had so many people ask me how I feel about it, given the decades that we've watched IU football not invest in itself, or IU athletics not invest in IU football. It's truly amazing to watch. It's funny. I think some of you saw Tom Allen's comments when he was asked about Indiana being in the playoff. And Tom was very gracious, I thought, in that. And we could get into some of the substantive elements of his comments. It was great, seeing him emphasize, as he should, many of the players that he recruited are part of the core of this team. But the idea of Indiana investing in football, as much as Indiana did invest more in football under Tom Allen and Kevin Wilson than they had previously, the core idea that good things can happen if you invest in football, and that Indiana has the financial heft to be able to do this. And it pays huge dividends in terms of not just the football program, not just the athletic department and the revenues that flow in that help to pay for everything else, but it helps the school, helps the university in its branding and marketing. The amount of Indiana-related signage in Times Square this weekend, the amount of exposure that the Indiana brand got during that Heisman Trophy ceremony, it's, as you've heard me say, it's millions, tens of millions of dollars in advertising that you didn't have to buy, that puts Indiana in the minds of fans and potential students and their parents across the country. There's very little else that you could do that would actually accomplish that. And it all comes from investment and maintenance. And it's a really uncertain time in college sports. And we see a lot of examples of schools that haven't figured that investment out, or maybe have the investment but don't have all of the pieces in place. And that's the other thing. It's not just about throwing money at it. Texas has thrown tons of money at football. Michigan's thrown tons of money at football. Michigan State's out there with $1 billion capital campaign specifically for athletics, but very specifically for football. It's not just that. It's also finding the right people, giving those people what they need to stay in position, and understanding that, as Curt Cignetti is fond of saying, you can never be satisfied. You've always got to be looking for new ways, new approaches, things that you might be doing that you think are perfectly fine now, but maybe there's a better way to do them. The scouting, the talent evaluation, the development, it's not just Cignetti, but that certainly helps, but it's the whole staff. Watching those folks get taken care of and watching them be valued in a way that is commensurate with what a top program would do should make you feel pretty good about being a fan of IU football right now. So anyway, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll have Andy Wittry joining us here on the show. Appreciate you folks tuning in. I hope that you're having a wonderful weekend. Stick with us. Right after this, we'll be back with more CrimsonCast here on the Back Home Network.
When the final buzzer sounds in Bloomington, the conversation starts here. The assembly call is IU basketball. Live post-game shows, smart midweek breakdowns, and no empty hot takes. Jared Morris, Coach Brian Tonsoni, Andy Bottoms, and Ryan Phillips dissect lineups, sets, and recruiting so you know what really happened and what it means for the Big Ten season, March, and beyond. Join the live chat on YouTube, then catch the podcast on Spotify and Apple. Just search Assembly Call and be part of Hoosier Nation's most trusted post-game tradition.
And joining us once again on the show, it's been a little while, Andy Wittry back with us. Andy, good to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Galen. Thanks for having me once again.
Yeah, a lot going on with college sports, and you covered it for a while, and you're keeping an eye on things from afar. Let's kind of hit the big news items that popped up here recently. First of all, last week there was a story that caught a bunch of people's attention, the announcement of a private equity deal between the University of Utah and this company called Otro Capital. This is an interesting deal as you dig into it, because it essentially spins most of the functions of an athletic department that you're used to off into a private entity that's controlled by the University of Utah and encompasses essentially everything but fundraising. So the traditional kind of varsity club still maintains with the school, almost certainly for tax reasons, but everything else, ticketing, sponsorships, event-related revenues, trademark licensing, the management of the teams, essentially goes outside the university. And they get an initial cash infusion from this Otro Capital company, who's been involved in sports before. I think they own like Alpine F1 and a couple of other entities. But they put $100 million in. And that also sets the stage for the possibility of donors to the University of Utah buying a stake in this company. The board for this company is essentially stocked with athletic director, trustees at the university, maybe a couple of these donors. It's a unique approach. It's got a lot of people worried. What was your initial reaction when you saw this, especially when we saw some of the other things that have been in the mix for Utah lately?
I think the first reaction was finally, right? We've had these discussions broadly in the industry for 2, 3, 4 years. And we know the due diligence and the process of vetting these deals starts even sooner. I mean, I think it was in June of 2023 when I had a company that reached out on behalf of a potential bank or PE firm wanting to pick my brain about one of these deals. So these have been floating in the ether for a long, long time now. So the fact that Utah is now the first one to dive into the deep ends and make that move at a time when the Big 12 was a one-bid league for the CFP, they have a new football coach. There's a lot of moving parts in their ecosystem. So I find the timing very interesting in that regard as well.
Yeah, the justification that Utah is given is essentially that, hey, we've just gotten hit with a yearly $20.5 million bill for revenue sharing, which everybody has in Division I FBS level athletics. Like, you're going to have to pay that, and when it goes up, you're going to have to adjust and go up with it if you want to stay competitive. And the problem for a lot of these schools is that they were already spending all the money that they were bringing in. They don't really have the opportunity, the way they're currently set up, to generate additional revenue. And this is something I think that a lot of people don't quite grasp with college athletics, is that we've all heard the trope of, well, nobody's making money in college athletics. That's been a choice. I just want everybody to note, like, it's not necessarily something that's a guarantee in college athletics. But the way that many athletic departments run things, they will take something like, let's say, concessions, and they will bid it out to third-party vendors. The third-party vendor will write a check for that amount, and then there'll be some kind of profit sharing above and beyond a certain number. And the argument up to this point has been, well, if you're an athletic department, you're not a specialist in vending concessions, or you're not a specialist in selling commercial advertising space. So that's why we're doing this, because we want to have a guarantee of money from that, but we also want to not have to deal with it on our own. This is kind of a different approach, where this is something that this company is going to try to specialize in, with the idea that ultimately there's got to be more revenue generated. You can't just assume that, well, we're going to get our $5 million from this or our $3 million from that, and that'll be it at this stage. You don't have the financial flexibility anymore.
No, and I think we mentioned the spin out. This is a a brand new company. And like you said, all this, the concessions, the ticketing is now under this new structure. And I do think that is part of the appeal, that you have people that are former Cleveland Browns executives and former sports industry executives, that they know this. So it's not just the money. It's also, it's their human capital, it's their experience, their network that they're leveraging. But I think there's also maybe a fair rebuttal too, that, okay, what is that next level that Utah can take their ticket sales? Because right now in this season, they had a 90-plus game consecutive home football sellout streak. That, okay, if you're selling out already, you can't sell alcohol at football or basketball games at that university. So there are certain caps, either due to their fan base or just due to that state. And so I'm curious, what is that incremental revenue? Is it more luxury suites? Is it increasing the price of hot dogs that only gets you so far? So what's that next level that, former Browns CROs and front office types can really leverage Utah and take it to that next level.
Yeah, I think a lot of fans have immediately jumped on the idea that this is going to mean higher ticket prices, which this is where it gets interesting in college athletics. There are many schools that sell a huge number of tickets. And as you mentioned, Utah's had this long sellout streak. And I think the athletic director in one of the articles I was reading even acknowledged that ticket prices were probably going to go up because if you've got that long of a sellout streak, you're probably undercapitalizing what you could be earning off of that. But this is where fans get upset because they immediately and rightfully say, well, we're going to get priced out. And same thing with concessions, same thing with merchandise. Although I think with some of these areas, one of the things that people don't always think about is that there aren't nearly enough approaches to generating revenue being taken by these different sectors because there's not really an incentive to. That has been a problem in air quotes with college athletics, because a lot of people will say, well, they shouldn't be focused on making money. The problem is all of this stuff is costing money. It was already expensive before the House settlement. Now you've got this huge cost, this $21 million cost every year that you have to pay athletes out of. And as I've tried to say on multiple podcasts, like, that money's got to come from somewhere. And it's not, you can't cut sports because people are upset about that. They don't want varsity sports being cut. They don't want the varsity sports experience for Olympic sports athletes to be reduced. You can't just cut sports that aren't generating money because a lot of those are generally women's sports in the Olympics areas, and that is a problem. You also can't really cut Olympic sports because that's your Olympic training program, essentially, for a lot of those sports. And so a lot of what's happening in college athletics with this is, hey, guess what? This was a bad system. It was a system that got preserved for way too long because there's not been an impetus to change it. Now the bill is coming due, and you have to include athletes in the share of revenues that you're bringing in as an athletic department. And there's not a lot of ways to increase the amount of revenues coming in. And then when you add in, I can't cut the logical things that I would cut expenses wise, it creates an issue where people look for third options. And this and the Big Ten deal end up being the options that are on the table because there's not a lot else on the table.
That's correct. I think for me, one of my biggest questions really is, how are they going to spend this money, right? What is the business plan? What is this NUCO going to do? Because like you said, there have not been the expense constraints to limit coaching salaries, to limit, I think we're seeing now some of the stadium renovations and upgrades. Those are slowing down. Like Ole Miss said, you know what? We're paying players. We're done upgrading stadiums and locker rooms for a while. So seeing what will Utah do, and they've been public a little bit with some of their plans, and they have a master sort of campus redesign, campus transformation. And so one of their districts, is what they're calling it, they have these 6 districts, is called College Town Magic. And it's sort of this 24/7 mixed use, housing, retail. Think like, what if it was, a tailgate kind of vibe, but 7 days a week? Not the grilling out and drinking, but just the shared community, shared spaces. And so if that's where this money is going, is to a space around athletics and creating new dorms, retail, shopping, entertainment, etc., I could see why that will be incremental to their revenue, right? And that's where I think, hopefully, many of these details of both the structure of the NUCO and then how that money will be used, hopefully that all becomes public, given this is a public school, that this is much larger than, we're going to go out and we're going to pull a Texas Tech and we're going to bankroll a $40 million roster and give a $12 million assistant coach salary pool in football. I think I'm more supportive if it's for this College Town Magic and it's redesigning campus. And they mentioned, their light rail and having more parking and all this kind of greater infrastructure. To me, if that works out, I can see why you signed this deal and say, you know what, give us the $500 million. We'll go to bed with private equity. We're going to spin off a lot of our athletic department. To me, that feels like the future, is this mixed use kind of public-private partnership. That could be really, really compelling if that hits.
And that's the thing. There are a lot of ways that I think in pro sports, what you've seen is this move towards capitalizing a district around a stadium with the idea that having an entertainment district makes a ton of sense. and building it around sports, which even though not everybody loves sports, most people will at least participate in the sports entertainment experience. And you don't necessarily have to be a big fan to want to go down to the stadium and engage in all of that. It's like I was reading about MLS is moving their calendar to match the world global calendar for soccer, where they're going to be playing essentially August to May. And one of the interesting aspects of that is a lot of these stadiums that have been used for games throughout the course of summers are now going to be open, or at least partially open if they're not also hosting an NWSL team, which means, well, now you can do concerts and now you can do other events, which allows you to increase your capitalization. And this is the piece that I think a lot of fans will miss in their analysis, because, and I find this interesting in general, Andy, and I'd love to get your take on this, like the response that you see, especially from media covering college football and other thought leaders, whether it's podcast hosts or whatever, it's all so consistently and uniformly opposed to anything involving outside investment or private equity, even when there are a lot of guardrails put in, that I think it almost has created this reflex whenever a deal like this is put forward, that it's automatically going to lead to awful things. Now, it might lead to awful things, or at least things that aren't helpful for consumers, but I think people forget that the goal here is, from the university's perspective, they need to generate revenue, not just to pay the private equity, but they need to generate revenue to pay the athletes and to maintain a balanced budget in their athletic departments. And with the traditional approach of these being athletic departments, especially in public universities, they're not set up as profit centers. Like they're set up to be, budget neutral, and this is the wrong era for that. It's really an artifact of a structural period in college history where everything was set up to not be a profit center, so you could avoid the argument that we're a professional sports enterprise. But now that you have to pay athletes, it's like you can get rid of that artifice. You can focus on the fact that, well, this is an entertainment product that is undercapitalized. I heard Ross Bjork, the Ohio State athletic director, talk about this on a panel at the Intercollegiate Athletics Forum, where he said, we've got a couple of different problems. One, like at Ohio State, we have 36 sports, 34 of them operate at a loss. We bring in almost $300 million in revenue, and it essentially ends up being revenue neutral. If we had what Texas's setup was, where we make a similar amount of revenue, but we had 15 fewer sports, we'd have like a $65 million a year surplus. I mean, there are economies here that have to change because so much is built on a model that frankly doesn't exist anymore. But there's a resistance to any kind of change in the system, I think partially out of fear, but also partially out of ignorance for how much this stuff actually costs and who's supposed to be paying the bills.
You're right, because at this point, it's one of those, it's like a Newton's law, right? It's something about inertia where based on where college sports is, like it needs some outside force that's external to exert itself on college sports. Could that be the U.S. government with a sports sector? We're going to have a new Olympic pipeline. We're going to have what other countries have around the world. Because if not, then it falls back on the feet of college athletics. And they're saying, we're tapping our donors now. This is what the fifth cycle for NIL. We're tapping our local businesses. Like, we need some new money. So you can see why now in 2025, they're looking towards institutional capital and PE and some of these investment funds, because they need to find the money somewhere. And that maybe explains partly why, it's the Utah was the first one of a single institution. The Big 12 was a conference just days later. Yahoo reported is nearing their own deal, structured a little bit differently, that it's not the Big 10 and SEC jumping in, because it's these schools and conferences that are still chasing and playing catch up, that it's some of the ACCs of the world, the Big 12s. If you're still at a loss year by year, and that's just compounding versus the Big 2, they need to be creative, if not a little bit desperate, to find these solutions. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Like you said, we're relying on the reporting of people like Ross Dellinger, who does a fantastic job, I think. But still, they are vetting what either, the school or the conference or maybe the fund itself is telling them. And so until we have the documents, which hopefully, like I said, will someday see the light of day, until we can look at that and then see what actually happens as far as Utah's infrastructure, their investment, there are a lot of questions. And I'm curious too, as far as the exit, they mentioned that Otro Capital has a 5 to 7 year exit planned, that if a lot of this money is being spent towards the infrastructure, this campus transformation, I'm curious just as far as the construction aspect. Can you really turn around this brand new district, new restaurants, dorms, shopping centers, et cetera, and have them really turn a 20+% profit, an ROI in 5 years? They're confident. I'd be curious if they can have that quick of a turnaround. But for me, that's where I think some of the answers or questions still lie, rather, is that if you have this pretty short time frame that's been floated, been publicized, and if you have people that, you know what, like, will the AD be there in 5 or 7 years, the new football coach, the president? This is an industry, I think, jobs at large in our country, but especially in college athletics, given the rate of change, is that these may not be 30-year jobs where it's the former baseball coach becomes the AD and he stays there for 22 years. It's people from the business world that they might come in for their 5 or 7 and be gone. So if this does go poorly or just even goes average, who is left holding the bag that is not the one that actually got the goodwill from the press release and the initial headlines and the money? Who is next left to pick up the pieces if this does not go out well?
I will say it does bring up a point I was thinking about at that summit last week, which is, and I forget who said it on what panel. There was so much information, but I thought it was a really interesting point. The problem right now that a lot of college athletic departments have is that they're run by the wrong archetypes of people. And it's interesting if you think about the progression of who have been athletic directors at power conference institutions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It tended to be, and it wasn't exclusively this, but it tended to be former players or former coaches. And then as you got into the 2000s and the 2010s and things changed, it gradually evolved to it was lawyers or former lawyers. It was people that came out of the compliance space because that was what the NCAA was focusing on, essentially as a shield to try to mask the huge increase in revenues that they were seeing out of television deals. Now you find yourself in a position where all of that's on the table and you have to make money. And so increasingly, I think what you're going to be seeing is athletic directors changing over and being business people or people from media. I mean, it's not accidental that Notre Dame, when Jack Swarbrick steps down, names Pete Bevacqua, who comes directly from NBC Sports, where he had been the president. It's not accidental that the Big Ten brings in Tony Petitti, who has a business background and a media background. Same thing with Brett Yormark with the entertainment background. You look down at the individual schools and you look at the ones that are succeeding right now, and it's generally people who have some kind of a demonstrated understanding of how business is supposed to work and how you can take what is traditionally a non-business minded entity in college athletics, or at least a non-profit generating entity, maybe would be a better way of putting it, and transitioning into something where you've got leadership that does have that background. And it's going to be fascinating watching that transition taking place even more across the board, because it feels like a few schools either hired the right person and they happened to be there at the right time, or saw this coming down the tracks early and figured out we've got to switch over to this model. And I think specifically about like those Big 12 and ACC schools, it's fascinating how many of them seem to have gotten caught flat-footed in terms of who they had in charge, because most of those schools, as we've seen on the field, are just way, way behind what SEC and Big Ten schools are doing right now in this in the space, and what they're able to do in terms of capitalizing on the resources that they've got.
There's a reason that Maryland hired, Jim Smith, the former Atlanta Braves executive, someone that also worked at Ohio State. You know, the Atlanta Braves, the Battery, kind of their ballpark district, that's sort of the gold standard in Major League Baseball, if not pro sports. That's who they hired for their ID, right? Colorado State, they hired someone who made a ton of money in the private sector, ran their collective, and now he's, on the inside as their AD. That's the future, right? Not that every one of those hires will work. Maryland is still a middle of the pack Big Ten school. We'll see what Colorado State's future is. But I think you're correct that transition from former coach or former player to the compliance director to then it became more of maybe the Scott Dolson type, right? The fundraiser, the person who's connected, knows where the money is. And then the next iteration, it might be, let's swing big, look for someone who might be an alum who has connections to pro sports or to the ticketing, to licensing, some of these sectors that we really, really need especially if we're playing catch up as a lower end Big 2 school or not a Big 10 school at all, the Big 10 school. I think that's the future. How do we find people that have this industry expertise that, have maybe the nostalgia from their days in undergrad or grad school and go back? Because right now, we're seeing compliance. I don't know what that looks like going forward. The CSC is still growing. It's still new. We're seeing, Jeremy Pruitt, they had a lawsuit recently that there was an injunction that his show cause, I think, is currently, it's unenforceable. So how many of these old era from even 10 years ago kind of rules and policies are even enforceable going forward? The name is chasing revenue, and I think we're seeing hires kind of follow that mold.
Yeah, it's really going to be fascinating as people think through the various approaches that you can take, which ones they decide to go with. One of the stories that popped up this morning, speaking of things I find interesting, San Diego State, which is in the new Pac-12, which is not going to be a power conference from a revenue perspective, that there was a suggestion or a request that they increase their student fees by 41% to support athletics. Now, San Diego State's got a lot of specific problems. They're not a big enough program or a successful enough program in either of their revenue sports to generate a huge amount of incoming revenue, and they have all of this debt service that they have to pay. I constantly hear people say, why don't colleges and universities back off of their spending for athletics? It even got mentioned in that 60 Minutes piece that they did on Indiana football. And this is a problem, I think, in the perception of how college athletics fits into the overall landscape of what universities are doing. As essentially now the front door of your university from a marketing perspective, you really can't afford to back off from athletics because there's no other real option to get your brand name out there. You think about San Diego State as just a regular person not living in California, you've probably heard of them. There are other state schools in California you likely have not heard of. And the reason you've heard of San Diego State is that they made the national championship game in basketball a couple of years ago, and they've generally had good teams there. You've probably heard of Florida Atlantic, and it's the same reason. So it's not just a simple matter of, well, you should just reduce your expenditures there. For big schools like Big Ten schools and SEC schools, there are additional benefits that you get in terms of perhaps generating revenue and making donors happy. But for some of these mid-level schools, this is the way that people know you exist. And in an era where there are going to be fewer college students because of the enrollment cliff and because of these other pressures, and you've got the president out there and you've got Google out there saying don't go to college, period. You're now in a competitive marketplace. The last thing you want to do is take one of the things that people view as a reason why to go to that school, and B, a reason or like a thing to do on campus that's fun and contributes to campus atmosphere. It really puts a lot of these mid-tier schools or the ones right below the Power 2 in a really tough spot, because going backwards or ceasing to be in this space is essentially kind of a death sentence from a marketing perspective.
I think at this moment in time, too, and I get back to when Scott Dolson and the administration moved on from Tom Allen, right, where this specific window of this 2, 3, 4 years, however many years we're in right now, of this kind of transformative time, where if you do not act, if you have a coach that's not winning and you leave them there a year or two too long, if the fan base and donor base is turned off and ticket sales decline, your NIL revenue or that revenue share pool is diminishing, if you're giving up or not trying right now, it would be a never. We don't know for sure, but given when a lot of these next media contracts come up, that the back channel conversations might start 1 or 2 years prior to that, as far as next conferences, Super League, media rights. What is Notre Dame to do after their latest playoff spurn? Like, what's coming next? That this is not the time, to your point, to give up just in athletics, because like you said, whether it's the enrollment cliff, it is the way that higher education is being thought of differently relative to the cost and what's the actual payoff after 4 or 5 years. Is it really worth it? That for all those reasons, now is the time to be all in, because if you're not, like, this might be it. If you're not in the upper echelon, whatever that breakaway might be, or super league, whatever this next thing is going to be, and it could be 5, 10, 15 years. If you're not above the cut line, whether that's 30 in pro sports, they've told us, right? The sweet spot's like 30, 32 schools. So really 60 spots, 65 or whatever that number might be, it might be half of that. So if you're not investing, winning, creating the campus back to Utah in the way that they would like to have this collaborative communal space, if you're not doing those things now and saying, you know what, we don't have the money, we don't have the right coach, we're just going to let them run out their contract, this could set you back 20 or 30 years. And I don't think that's hyperbolic.
Yeah, it really creates a problem. And I think we've got some schools in the Big Ten that might be on the wrong side of that divide, given what's happened over the last 5 years. And yes, if you're an Indiana fan, which I'm assuming you are if you're watching this podcast, be very, very grateful that you the particular group of people and the particular things that occurred in the order that they did happened, because this kind of feels like, you know, getting on the last chopper out of town before the town explodes. Indiana did that, and it's wild to think about how different the economics were even 5 years ago on this, and it's only going to get more difficult for schools that haven't put the investment in. This is what makes the question a bit about the ACC so fascinating, because there's a certain hubris that has been associated with the ACC. And it was the same thing that we saw with the Pac-12, where it's like, well, we don't have to engage in this arms race. And then one day you wake up and you discover that you are outgunned from all angles. It's not going to be pretty. That does lead me into the last topic I wanted to talk with you about, which is where the CFP is at now 2 years in, especially in relation to the media reaction to what happened with Notre Dame, as you mentioned, but also what could have been in terms of the ACC potentially not getting any teams in. The committee really looks like it went out of its way to figure out a way to get an ACC team in, knowing that the rules that had been put in place weren't going to get the automatic qualifier in. It's a tenuous alliance, to say the least, and there seems like there's a lot of pressure coming from multiple angles to, again, change the system. How do you think this experiment is going so far, and where do you think it goes next?
I think the move from 4 to 12 has been a tremendous success, right? I think that, you know, in year one, back in, I think the 2014 season, watching those semifinals, my dad and I were like, why didn't they choose 6 off the bat, right? Like, you have 5 Power 5 conferences, at least one is getting left out, if not 2. So the 4-team model never really, I think, made complete sense as far as the equity, the representation, the fairness, all those kind of like big college sports terms that gets thrown around. So I think 12, as far as the fresh faces, obviously we here in town are benefiting so much, the football program, the university, the alumni base, etc. But I think that the rotating cast of characters, where every year when the playoff field is announced, my dad and I will predict the next seasons, which now with the portal and all that, you have no clue like who's on what team, who's gonna be the next coach of that team. But we project, okay, who's gonna make it next year? And in the 4-team era, you could say, you know what, pick 4 of Ohio State, Clemson, Bama, Georgia, Oklahoma, and you'd go 3 for 4 and say, all right, you know, we know 3 of the 4 teams might have a new face. So I think the level of interest nationally, and to have some of these group of 5 schools, the James Madisons, some of these upstarts that are getting that chance, is really exciting. I think that my fear long term is that when you change the rules because your feelings get hurt on an annual basis. So last year was some of the seeding and the buys, which understandably, I don't know if that made total sense, but to have a quick, you know, knee-jerk reaction, we're going to change that rule. This year, I think more changes will be coming. And I know some of this might be based on the contract of when they're allowed to, but I think the rate that we're tracking, both in terms of future expansion, which seems all but guaranteed, maybe not for next year, but within a handful of years, but then also the rules about how you get in, you know, in Pete Bevacqua's media tour, when he was going scorched earth on the Dan Patrick show with Ross Dellinger, you know, he had let it slip that based on the MOU they've signed for potential expansions, where if they're in the top 12, I think starting next year, they'd be guaranteed to make a spot based on the committee's rankings. If it's a 14-team playoff, if they're in the top 14, they're guaranteed. So I think that rubbed a lot of folks the wrong way, and folks were not aware of that little wrinkle. So I think based on trying to appease everyone is that they're going to continue to expand. My hope is it does not exceed 16, because if that's a clean bracket, there's still, I think, teams that were left out this year that could be contenders for the semifinals, right? And Notre Dame, maybe a Texas if they get their act together. But I think you want these schools and fan bases that are the first, second, third team out. You want that passion. You want them to feel hurt that they were robbed. Because if we ever expand too far, where if it's 24 teams and the Big Ten gets their way and there's auto bids and all that nonsense, if the debate then is that, okay, team number 25 and it's a 9-3 American school, or it's an 8-4 Big Ten school that finished 7th, if that's the team that was the snub in more of like a March Madness style way where you went 19-13 and, oh, this is so unfair, I think it's going to water down the system. So to expand too far and then to change every single year, which I think we might be tracking towards based on seeding and buys and, are they going to be reseeding and potential future iterations? I think that's a concern where just if Bama doesn't get their way or Notre Dame or whatever blue blood, we now have to cause a ruckus and change the whole thing. I think at some point fans will be exhausted. You're going to lose fans who don't know how to follow. Okay, I think my team's in, but where am I seated? What's the bracket? Who do I play next? There's a point where I think you might get a little bit too greedy, and I think the sport's still growing in a really healthy way. But is there a point where there's just too much too fast, and it's like, you know what? The regular season's watered down. The playoff, it's an extra 5 or 6 games. What are we left with? That's my fear long term. But I do think on the whole, it's a really good system. And I say that wearing an IU polo from Homefield, and we're the number 1 overall seed. So clearly there's some bias in your narrator here. But I do think there are concerns looming.
It's an interesting philosophical point because I actually have settled on the other side of that divide where I think some expansion would be good. And the reason why is ultimately a lot of what we've seen in college football has been gatekeeping. It's been a limitation of who gets into the party at the very end. And that made sense in an era where what you were trying to capitalize was the national championship game, that idea, which is not that old of an idea. We've really only had a theoretical, comprehensive national championship game since 1998 when the BCS was put into play. But now you find yourself in a spot where you're already undercapitalized in terms of your television revenues compared to something like the NBA, where the NBA, if you compare the number of people that watch the games and the overall fan interest, it should rank far behind college football, yet the NBA makes significantly more money than college football all told on its media deal. So how do you get there? Now, some of that is better negotiation and not letting networks dictate things from the inside, which is essentially what a lot of these college conferences have done. Fox essentially dictates what the Big Ten's doing, ESPN dictates what the SEC's doing, and so forth. But it's also about growing the pie and getting more schools and more fan bases and more donors interested in the sport for a longer period of time. And I do worry sometimes that in the balance of like what makes college football special, the argument is, well, it's the exclusivity that makes it special. This was always the argument against expanding the playoff. It's like, well, the regular season has to mean something. And the problem with that is if you're Notre Dame or a Notre Dame fan, you, in the old system, you would have had to shut down after the first 2 games of this year. If you were a group of 5 team, unless you were really interested in what second-tier bowl your champion was going to go into, or maybe you were going to be the one that got picked to go play in the Fiesta Bowl, you didn't really have a great reason to watch. You didn't have a great reason to continue to buy merch. Now you do. And I would actually say that an extra round of playoff games and the additional revenue that you get. Think about what's going on this weekend. College football's playoff starts on Friday. And they've essentially had to sacrifice 2 of their TV slots because they will be going up against the NFL on that Saturday. The NFL starts its Saturday games because of a longstanding glitch in the way that the television contracts work. It's not really a glitch, but it's essentially, this was when the college season used to end. And that was, the NFL couldn't do Saturday games until this upcoming weekend. And that's always been how it's been. But are people really going to watch Oregon, James Madison in large numbers, or are they going to watch, Tulane, Ole Miss in large numbers because there's going to be NFL games going up against them? Probably not as much as you would see otherwise. Imagine starting the playoffs a week earlier and having a full weekend where it's just that focus. I keep coming back to this idea that again, when you're thinking about getting more fans involved, getting more people watching games, having more games matter, as much as the regular season used to be the only thing that mattered, when you have a playoff, the playoff becomes the thing that matters. You can't have both. So you might as well figure out a way to make the playoff matter as much as possible. And as you mentioned, there maybe only are 65, 70 teams that could reasonably expect to be in a playoff, but 20 teams out of that 64 teams is not an unreasonable number. It's not too different from what the NFL does. I mean, the NFL has almost half their teams in the playoff. Nobody complains that one is too big.
You're right. I hear that completely, because I think that having that hope, like you said, that even if you're in Indiana, pre-Signetti Indiana, where it's like, you know what, once every 20 years, we might make it. If you're there on campus, or if you're in town for that 1 in 20 years, that's an all-time memory. And now, let alone if you make it once like IU did last year, and they can sustain that, and suddenly, you know what, you're a top 10 program in this new era. That's insane. And that wouldn't be possible without the 12-team playoff that created this opportunity. So I do think that the access, and also I think reimagining what this sport means, to your point, where the historical nature of it comes down to undefeated seasons. If you have one loss in like Columbus, your week or month is ruined. And I think, as they showed last year in that city, that, you know what, you could still have the chance to grow as a team, rebound, shuffle some things around, and still win a national title, which is pretty cool. And I do think there's a way that you could reimagine maybe the end of the regular season, what the conference championship week is. You know, Michigan and Jim Harbaugh have had an interesting, let's say, 7 years or so, especially the last couple months and last year. But what he suggested in COVID with it was called like the carousel week or the round robin week, where basically you didn't know that the rivalry week opponent, or that like the final week, until I think like a week and a half prior. And I think half those games were canceled due to positive tests. We can leave all that in the past, luckily. But I think that concept, and applying that to almost play-in games from the conference now going to the playoff, that the TV partners, they're going to need that revenue right now, especially the SEC championship, then the Big Ten championship. Those are major money makers. And so if you were to have a 2 or 3 game round robin, you know, having both of us, went to the IU basketball and football doubleheader in Indy, and that day was special for all the obvious reasons. But if you had that where it was football alone, and it was, 1 versus 6 in the conference, and then 2 versus 5 and 3 versus 4, and that led to either do you make it or what's your seed, I think that could be the future, and in a way that the TV partners would really enjoy, to have more inventory and sell ads against that. So I think there is a way that we can hopefully modernize the sport while promoting that access for all those reasons that you had stated, Galen.
Yeah, and look, I know some people will always seize on these conversations to say, well, you guys are focused on the wrong things, or you don't like college sports like they're supposed to be. I've really had to settle into a mode where I'm just trying to take a realistic approach to talking about this stuff, and whether or not people want college athletics to be where they are right now, they are there right now. And whether it's what we talked about at the top of the show with spinning things off into private entities that are external to the university, which is not a new idea. And in fact, it's not even, Kentucky did that a year ago, and it's like everybody forgot about it. They didn't take private equity money yet. But, ultimately, for what I am looking at, and I think you're in the same boat, the reality is just a lot different than what many fans and, frankly, a lot of the media that cover college athletics are really acknowledging. And at some point, someone's got to acknowledge that the realities have shifted, and there's not really a good way to shift them back to the way that they used to be. So my hope is that you can retain some of the core elements of college athletics. And I think a lot of that is not nearly as under threat as people argue that it might be. But the key in all of this is this all costs a lot of money, including the sports that don't generate any money. And there's not a good way to fix any of it without broadening the pie significantly. And there's only a certain number of ways to do that.
I think it's spot on. It's now or never. We have to be open-minded. And I think it's great we finally have, real case studies for Utah, for the Big 12. I think that we should hopefully want those to be successful, because if they are, that's going to inspire copycats in a good way, right? And if they can show proof of concept in what worked and what didn't, and the future SBJ conferences of the world that you just attended. Can Utah do a session and show the world, like, here was our blueprint, here's what worked, here's how we spent that money? Because like I said, if this goes towards reimagining campus and helping enrollment, like as part of that pitch deck that we showed earlier on the YouTube side, is that they want to be like a top 10 public school. They want to increase enrollment. They want to promote infrastructure and transportation. Like, yes, sports are a big part of that, but it's larger. So I think that's the hope, is that does this get back to, there's a reason they named that College Town Magic for that district, right? Back to like that communal sense of identity, the good feelings, the good times. Can we build campus in that way versus pulling, just like I said, like a Texas Tech, and this is now $500 million going to rosters? I don't think that's the case. And I really hope that schools, if they do embark on these kind of deals, it's not just for the portal window in January and December and chasing transfers, because those are just payday loans, and that's not going to be a good ROI. But to make your campus even stronger, I think I can get behind that.
Andy Wittry, appreciate you joining me as always. Fun conversation. We'll look forward to chatting with you again, hopefully during the college football playoff. Have a good rest of the week, and good luck with finals week.
Thank you. Anytime, Galen.
All right. My thanks again to Andy Wittry. Always enjoy talking with him. And my thanks to all of you for tuning in and chatting some IU football. We'll have more coming up soon. I'll have some podcasts coming up this weekend. Might have a live with Rhett Lewis. So keep an eye out for that as we break down either Alabama or Oklahoma. As the time that I'm recording this, don't know who won that game. I will find out within the next 6 hours, and we'll come back and chat about it. As exciting times with IU getting a chance to play an SEC opponent, regardless of who wins that game, in Pasadena, and test the mettle of the Hoosiers on the national stage once again. Be sure to stay tuned to the Back Home Network. So much wonderful content coming up for you during the holidays. Sideline Stories will be releasing a new episode early next week. Very special Indiana football-themed guest that I know you will enjoy. We'll also have the Big Red Carpet with Rhett Lewis. Be sure to check out not just the free podcasts on YouTube, but also check out Big Red Carpet's Substack, as Rhett Lewis pumping out some amazing content. A great interview recently with Terry Talon, who is a name that you all either know or should know with IU football, has been incredibly important to the program and IU athletics as a whole. Obviously, Assembly Call up and running and analyzing IU men's basketball, as a couple of games going on this weekend, Chicago State and Siena coming up before the break. Doing the Work podcast, monitoring IU women's basketball, the Dribble Drive. So many amazing shows here on the Back Home Network, and more content, of course, coming from CrimsonCast as well, as we get you ready for the Rose Bowl. All right, I'll break now, heading off to an anniversary dinner, and looking forward to celebrating with my wife. 14 years married this weekend. So thanks to all you folks, as always, for tuning in and joining us. I'm Galen Clavio. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.